The McAlvany Weekly Commentary, covering monetary, economic, and geopolitical news events. Now here are Kevin Orrick and David McAlvany.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. David, today we're in the Bahamas with Richard Rahn, and of course last year we interviewed him as well. He had a great interview last year. We had a lot of comments. Again, Richard Rahn is a man who's motivated highly by the political changes in the country all through his life. After the Carter years, he went to work for Reagan, and then after that, the first George Bush. So what do you think he brings to the table this year?
Well, he regularly comments for the Cato Institute, and you'll find his columns with some frequency in the Wall Street Journal. And what we want to do is just have sort of a DC perspective, if you will. Some of the things that are changing policy related that do have a direct impact into the financial markets.
Yeah.
And, we can have our opinions, but to be quite honest with you, Durango's a long way from the Beltway.
Well, and Richard, I have to tell you, it's one of those things, David, we went to New York to do the video a couple of years ago, and then we went on over to Washington, D.C., and I'm telling you what, it was like going into a bubble, like a completely different world. You couldn't feel the economic downturn. You couldn't feel any kind of consistent consciousness.
Yeah, and Kevin, that was a few years ago, and the point was, we saw a transformation taking place. The power center, which had been New York City,
right,
was the baton being passed, if you will, to D.C., passed or taken, as it were. And D.C. now is in a very strong position, Washington, D.C., to control outcomes within the capitalist system. There are challenges to the capitalist system which we will have to see if that system in fact survives the pressures. I believe it will. Kevin, the challenge to capitalism is now the state is challenging basically the corporate structures which has become dominant over the last 30 or 40 years, with finance becoming more and more important as we go. Well, with finance being a part of that, we want to look at how individuals are navigating this. Last year, with our conversation with you, Richard, we talked about FATCA. FATCA is legislation that's already been passed and will be implemented in 2013. Which,
of course, you're talking about the Foreign Accounts Compliance Act. That's
exactly, and this is what is ultimately limiting in terms of an American's ability to have assets anywhere else in the world. And it's strange because, well, it's not important to most people. It is strange to be told you have to keep your money inside these walls. When you're handcuffed, you realize that you're restricted. Without the handcuffs, there was no issue.
Well, David, it used to be when we talked about government regulation here in America, we talked about government regulation here in America. But what's happening is FATCA's America going outside and regulating everything outside of its borders as well. And so
foreign banks and financial institutions having to comply with U.S. legislation and being held liable if they don't. Kevin, it's not so much the issue of people having an account overseas, is that they can't have an account overseas. And that's the real issue. You are free to live your life as you choose as an American. Land of the free and home of the brave. No, not outside our borders is the edict coming through FATCA. Richard Rahn, this is the second year we've had the opportunity to sit down and visit. Bahamas is a good place to reflect back on the U.S. and, from an outside perspective, be thinking about not only domestic policy but foreign policy. Something that we covered last year in our conversation was FATCA. The legislation is pending, so to say. It won't be an issue until 2013. But are things getting better or worse? Are they revising it in our favor? What do you see happening with FATCA and legislation like that?
Well, of course, the legislation was passed, and what they're working on is the implementing rules. And Treasury has a huge amount of discretion of how the Foreign Accounts Transactions Compliance Act, FATCA, is actually implemented. The problem is they keep trying to make it broader and broader and bring in more and more financial institutions, and not just banks, it's any foreign financial institution. And then they also get hobbled with huge definitional problems. And last week I was talking to one of the attorneys involved, and he said it's now up to about 350 pages. And his judgment was it's getting worse, and he's one of the people who's got day-to-day involvement with it. The administration keeps saying, well, they're trying to make it easier to comply with. But of course, these things get bigger and bigger, And when you have regulations that go on hundreds of pages, nobody understands what it is. And we've seen things like this happen in the past, and finally they just often almost die of their own weight. The whole notion is stupid to begin with. It's destructive because it drives capital out of the United States. We would be appalled if foreign countries tried to do things like that to us. And it makes it almost impossible for Americans abroad to get bank accounts. And so foreign banks and other institutions increasingly are just not going to accept any U.S. clients or even invest in the U.S. And this could cause us as much as $1 trillion in lost foreign investment. And of course that means a huge reduction in the number of jobs created in the United States, the kind of capital we need for R&D and just for economic growth. It's Washington insanity at its worst.
Well, would a change in elections this next year from one party to the next, would it improve anything, or is the die cast concerned?
It could improve things. I think there is some increased pressure just for repeal. Particularly the Americans abroad have been very vocal on it. And I would expect a Republican Treasury to be less intrusive and try to be more reasonable in the regulations than the current Treasury. One problem we have with the current Treasury, there's virtually nobody there who's actually ever been in the private sector. And they have very little understanding of the cost of regulations, how these things are implemented. It also has a disproportionate burden on smaller financial institutions than the bigger ones, because the cost of regulation, to some extent a fixed cost, you've got to set up your compliance procedures and all the new software, and the stuff is very costly to train your people and all that. But if you're a very large institution, you can of course amortize this over many more clients. So actually regulation, financial regulation in general, just not this act, has driven much of the consolidation. People say, oh, they're concerned about these very big financial institutions. Well, it's regulation itself that does that, particularly like we see it in the United States, because small banks can't afford the burden of regulation. They're forced to combine just because of the increasing cost of compliance.
The size and scale of the too big to fails is impressive. Going back to 2007, your Bank of America, your Wells Fargo, your JP Morgan, the argument as we came into the crisis in 2008 where these were system critical institutions and they literally were too big to fail. The irony is that by 2011, the end of 2011, those institutions grew at a minimum 24% in terms of assets. In the case of Wells Fargo, 142%. They were too big to fail. What are they now? You're right, this is a certain form of insanity. It's driven consolidation.
Yep.
It's not exactly what we would view as free market capitalism. What might you describe sort of the market, can you call it a mechanism, or what kind of a market do we have today, if not free market capitalism?
Well, it is, in certain ways, it's almost fascism in that you have state control of privately owned institutions. And the managers of these institutions have less and less discretion, and people in government have more and more control over them, just in how they operate. And this, of course, undermines the whole free market system. And we know from past experience, other countries around the world, for the last 150 years, when this stuff has been tried, it's always ended up in failure. And will in the United States, unless it's all reversed. But the Dodd-Frank bill, impossible. Sarbanes-Oxley still hasn't been repealed. That's just caused much of the dry up in IPOs in the U.S. And so now people who want to do initial public offering go elsewhere in the world.
Well,
and
is it fair to say that the 20s were a period in time where power was consolidated in New York? In the 30s, we saw a migration of that power. The power center became Washington, D.C. We're seeing the same sort of parallel where you could say the last 15, 20 years even, it's been about New York and banking and finance. And that's in fact what we're seeing is a swing back towards governmental control and a focus on the power structures in D.C. If there is a similarity, is there anything we can learn from the 30s and 40s, in terms of how we claw ourselves out of that and move back towards free markets?
Well, we've got a long history of what doesn't work. And again, with the big regulations in the early 1930s, basically that the regulations, the tax policy, the spending policy, and monetary policy at the time kept us in a depressed economic state for more than a decade. It's interesting to note that we had a very sharp recession back in 1907, and which was as sharp a drop as we had after the 29-30 crash. But in 1907, government didn't interfere, and within 18 months the economy came roaring back and made up for lost ground, because a capitalistic system has these automatic correctives within the system, and it's painful for those number of months when you go through what they used to call panics, now we call recessions. But with government coming in there and trying to mitigate it, it usually makes things worse. Look at the housing market. Now we've been in depressed housing for 4 years. The situation is not getting better. So having all these foreclosures. And the basic problem is the government did not allow housing prices to drop right off to get to their new equilibrium point. And if you're trying to prevent the house price from falling, then you never get to the equilibrium point, and you keep getting people in houses they can't afford. And then if you have an artificially low rate mortgage, then when the mortgage interest payments start to go back up, the person's back in the soup again. Washington tries to insulate people from reality, and of course what it does is only delays the reality and makes it much worse when it finally comes around.
It's been suggested that the budget was really not politicized until after World War II, and with the advent of greater voting rights, which we are all in favor of, but with that came the consequence of politicians being much more concerned about where and how the money was spent, the constituency groups that received it, and the budget was, in the context of universal suffrage, completely politicized.
Actually, I'm not in favor of expanded voting rights. Our founding fathers understood a fundamental truth. They were basically against democracy. That's why they formed us as a republic. We're a constitutional republic. And they couldn't figure any other way to do the transitions except for democracy. But democracy was a tool for the federal republic. And they deliberately limited the voting franchise at that point to property-owning males. But there was something to be said for, this will sound in this day and age totally politically incorrect, I understand, but for having people who really have a stake in the system. You've probably all seen the late night comedians when they do these interviews with people on the street, where you got a high percentage of people who have no idea who the Vice President of the United States is, they have no idea of the three branches of government.
Well, this Vice President they might not know, because I don't think he's made a public appearance in 3.5 years.
Well, they try to keep him locked up. But anyway, but the problem is we have large numbers of people who have no idea. It's not a matter of being left or right. They just are totally ignorant when they walk into the voting booth. And it was interesting with the State of the Union address. I commented in my weekly column. And there is a group who measures at what level each State of the Union address is addressed to. And this was at an 8th grade reading level. And that's the lowest since the 1930s. And you can see this dumbing down of government all the time. And as they dumb things down, you tend to get worse and worse policies because people don't understand the consequences. An issue that has concerned me is, again, this attack by the Treasury on foreign banks who happen to have U.S. clients. And the politicians in Washington, people like Carl Levin and other demagogues, they get up there and start shouting about people evading their taxes. Well, there are a few people who do that. But the tax loss is minuscule compared to the cost to the economy of all the capital it's driven out, and also the reductions in liberty. And this hypocrisy, this American financial imperialism, which we would never tolerate from any other country. And this is extremely destructive.